Okay, good morning, everybody. And those watching this on our online study, glad to have you with us too. And we're moving quickly toward the end of our study of Jeremiah and his personal feelings and lamentations. We'll be doing that next week as we wrap up this whole quarter. Some of you may know these two people I'm about to talk about. There was a young man. His last name was Barrow. He was arrested in 1931, and he served some time. Once he was released from prison, he was visiting a friend. She had a broken arm. There was a young lady there helping her while she was mending from her wounds, broken arm, and her last name was Parker. The two of those met that day, and they became sort of smitten with each other. And over the next 2 years, they robbed, stole, and killed about 15 people. And over 2 years' time, 9 different policemen trying to capture them were shot and killed. But after 22 months on the run, 1934, they were captured on a country road in Louisiana and shot at 130 times. You'll know them as Bonnie and Clyde. They weren't by themselves. They had a little gang. Some of them popped in and out. Some of Clyde's brothers, and but some of those got caught and everything. But but the reason I bring that up is because they thought they were invincible. They thought everywhere they went, they could do what they wanted to, when they wanted to, and they could evade the law. But eventually, they got caught. They didn't just get caught, they were killed on the spot. And like I mentioned, over 130 shots were fired. Now, there's a video on, I think it's Netflix, I don't know, movie. And I haven't ever seen it, but I did last night when I was just poking around trying to do some more research on them. I watched the last scene of whatever that movie is. I don't know if I want to watch the whole movie, but but the last scene is finishing them off, and I'm gonna tell you, I didn't want to watch it anymore of it. There was enough gunshots in 30 seconds, and it's pretty graphic. So, not encouraging you to go watching it, just trying to tell you how it was. But the reason I went to search for them is the first people I could think of that I could sort of compare or listen today to. Another one might be Jesse James. You've heard other people from the past in history that were on the run for a long time and they finally met their justice. But the reason I wanted to go that route is because the title of our lesson is Just. And the writer has put in there, judgment awaits those who defy God. And so the point of our lesson is going to be a couple of things, but the main one being you cannot outrun God if you're in defiance of Him. Anyone who is in rebellion of God, even though they think they're just fine, they're going to get away with everything. In the end, God will have His say. And we're going to look at today the prophecies from Jeremiah on 10 nations who had not necessarily tortured, but some of them did. But they had persecuted the people of Israel and Judah through the years. And the first 45 chapters of Jeremiah are all about calling the people to repentance. Everything we've done up to this point has been Jeremiah talking to the people, his people, begging them, pleading with them, come back to God, listen to us, and listen and pay attention because there's judgment coming for you if you don't. And He's pronounced the exile on them. He's pronounced their destruction. He's announced the oncoming attacks from other nations, and they didn't listen. We've read those verses through the book where it says, and they did not listen, and they did not listen. Just over and over, the more Jeremiah said, the less they even paid him any attention. And he almost was like the boy who cried wolf because he kept saying it and nothing had happened yet. But then those waves started to come, attacks from Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. They started taking them one by one, carrying those groups of people back to Babylon into exile. So everything in those first 45 chapters are all about calling the people to repentance. From 46 on, which is what we're going to hit today, 46 through 52, is about the judgment on those nations. And God will take his attention off of the people of Judah for the rest of this book. And Jeremiah is going to issue the prophecies of judgment on those nations. Now, we're going to bounce around some, and so this is not in your book, but you'll have your Bible handy, if you will, and we're going to be in Revelations and Isaiah. So we're going to start in Revelations. We'll go over to 13 and 1. 13 and 1. Because in 46 through 52, he's going to go through 10 nations, and it begins with Egypt. And if you remember way back in history, when Pharaoh took the people from Israel and would not release them, and Moses had to keep going to him over and over. So we'll begin with that nation, and then through all those centuries, he leads through, as we go through chapters 46 through 52 in Jeremiah, he names one nation after another. There's 10 of them. Now go to Revelations 13 and verse 1. All right, and it reads, "And I saw a beast coming up out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads." Those 10 horns right there are these 10 nations we're going to be talking about today. So I want you to try to learn with me as we realize that what Jeremiah is writing in his book is meant for the people of that day, and it also is prophesying towards a time that's not even come for us, the last day. And we're going to be talking about 2 Babylons, okay, even though they carry the same name. We're going to be talking about the nation of Babylon then, and then the Babylon known as the evil world in the future. And we'll be hitting that Babylon in Revelations as we get toward the end of the lesson. But I wanted to carry, because in Revelations 13:1, when it says the 10 horns on the 7 heads, picture a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. Those 10 horns is these nations we're going to be talking about. Okay, now go to Isaiah chapter 13. Once we bounce a few chapters, a few books here, we're going to get into the main heart of our lesson. Isaiah, we're going to 13, and then find verses 19 and 20. Isaiah 13, 19 and 20. Give you a second to find it. Isaiah 13. Start reading. "And Babylon," this is Isaiah speaking more than 100 years before Jeremiah. "And Babylon, the jewel of the kingdoms, the glory of the pride of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. It will never be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation. A nomad will not pitch his tent there, and shepherds will not let their flocks rest there, but desert creatures will lie down there, and owls will fill the houses, ostriches will dwell there, and wild goats will leap about." So you see, as Babylon is named as a country that's going to be in destruction, because it says it will be like Sodom and Gomorrah, and we all know what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. It was destroyed by fire. Okay, but notice in verse 20, "It will never be inhabited or lived in." This in Babylon that Jeremiah's time period knew will no longer exist ever again. All right, now go to the next page over, Isaiah 14, with verse 12. So, before I read it, throughout history, anyone and anything that worked on behalf of Satan and in rebellion to God could be listed as someone who was Antichrist, okay? So we've kind of had lessons in the past where we talked about who was the Antichrist. Well, there's the Antichrist in the future. We don't see that person yet, okay? But anyone who's been in rebellion has been working for Satan, right? And so that would be, think of whoever you want to be, Pharaoh, Herod, when he's trying to kill Jesus, Hitler. I mean, we can just name people throughout history. Anyone who has been on the wrong side has been in rebellion. But Babylon was a a nation that Satan saw as the crown jewel. You noticed it said, the glory of the pride of the Chaldeans. It was like the nation that was perfect for Satan and his evil demons to work with. So you go over to verse 12 and 14 and watch what it says. Shining morning star, how you have fallen from the heavens. You destroyer of nations, you have been cut down to the ground. You said to yourself, I will ascend to the heavens. I will set up my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of God's assembly in the remotest parts of the north. I will ascend above the highest clouds. Listen to this one. I will make myself like the Most High. And Most High is capitalized. Who's talking? This is Satan. Who's the only person, creature, whatever, that was thrown out of the heavens that we read in verse 12? That's Satan. So what we're looking at here is Isaiah saying 100 years earlier, there's going to be destruction that comes from Babylon, and Babylon's king, leader, whatever, is Satan himself. All right, now we're looking at Satan's arrogance, those verses. That's the same arrogance that we look at when we look at Pharaoh, when we look at King Herod, when we're looking at King Nebuchadnezzar. That same mindset and arrogance that says, I don't have to listen to God. I don't have to worship God. I am God. I am my own entity. I don't need him. And sadly, that's the same attitude that we see throughout history of anyone who said, I don't need God. I'll do my own thing. And that's present today too. And we'll hit a little statement or two on that later. But we're seeing Satan's arrogance there. And so Babylon has been judged throughout the Bible. When we go back to Genesis, do you remember the Tower of Babel? When the attitude of the people was, we're going to build a tower and we'll be like God. We'll get just as high as he will. And they were judged for it. Isaiah and Jeremiah judges the Babylon, nation of Babylon. We just read of the judgment of Babylon, the future Babylon that's going to be Satan's headquarters, the Antichrist headquarters in the end days. And that's in Revelation. So we got from Genesis all the way through the Bible to Revelations as a judgment on Babylon. So that's the nation. When we want to see a nation that Satan uses to work with, that's the one. Now, go back to your lesson. Well, stay in the Bible for a second. Go back to Jeremiah again. And we're on chapter 50, of course. But back up to 46. Because that's when these nations begin to be judged. Through 45, like I mentioned, it's all about the people's call to repentance. Okay, call for repentance. But 46, watch where it says prophecy against the nations. That's the subheading in my Bible. Probably is in yours or something similar. And you see it starts with Egypt. Prophecies against Egypt. Flip on to 47. Prophecies against the Philistines. 48, against Moab. Okay, keep on going. You'll see Ammon. Prophecies against Edom. King Herod was an Edomite. Prophecies against Damascus. Kedar and Hazor. So you see these nations. Now there's one theme through all those first 9. If you read all those chapters, they all judged, but they're all going to be, every one of them, except for the 10th one, Babylon. Babylon will not have a comeback. Babylon will be destroyed forever, because that's what we read in Isaiah. The same thing happens in our lesson today as we read. We're going to be reading verse in chapter 50. So that's going to be the big difference. You're going to see them not have a return. It's going to be a forever destruction. It's going to be like Sodom and Gomorrah rained down. The people are going to be shocked by it. They're not going to be prepared for it, but it's going to be permanent. And so in verse 11 in chapter 50, in your study book, that's where it starts, but we'll read this and kind of get going. So it says, because you rejoice, because you celebrate, you who plundered my inheritance. because you frolic like a young cow treading grain and neigh like stallions. So he's calling them out, these nations, but he's saying to Babylon, but he's saying all of them, all those 10, because you you enjoyed trampling on my people. You enjoyed persecuting them. You enjoyed having injustice on them. You enjoyed trying to demolish them, trying to steal from them, loot from them, kill them. Because you've done all that, you acted like, you see where he names a young cow treading grain, like neighing like stallions. Now, we used to have little sheep. Baby lambs will be born. And when they were about 3 weeks old, 2 to 3 weeks old, they could get where they could walk pretty good, you know. And they get out in the morning, and it feel real good, or late in the evening, and you ever seen them start hopping around and skipping and jumping, and they're cute as can be to watch. Well, young livestock do that. Look, Mark's got cows. He said those young ones, they get feeling real good. They go hopping and jumping, and when they feel good, they do that. They're having a good time. Well, whenever the farmers were harvesting some of the crops, especially the grain, they would, as they were doing the threshing, they would turn the young animals out and let them eat some of what was left over. And it was so good to them, they'd hop around and jump like this. So he's using that as a picture for them to understand. You jump around like a young cow treading grain. And he's saying, you enjoy it so much, persecuting my people, that it's sickening to watch. He said, because you rejoice, because you celebrate, you who plundered my inheritance. Remember, we've seen a lot of times in Scripture where God calls Israel his inheritance. His inheritance, the thing that's been given to him, the thing that he cherishes as something that's precious. So he says in verse 12, because of this, your mother will be utterly humiliated. This mother is Babylon. Okay, your mother will be utterly humiliated. She who bore you will be put to shame. So we're talking about the one who gave birth to all this evil, Satan himself. But these nations, you're going to be put to shame. The one who started all this, the one who started all this plundering, is going to be put to shame. He says, look, she will lag behind all the nations, an arid wilderness, a desert. And you think about those adjectives there, a wilderness and a desert and desolate and all these kinds of things. They're going to go from supremacy to desolation. There's been nation after nation through history that was a mighty power at one point and then nothing not too long after their destruction. Babylon is going to be like that. Babylon had an incredible economy. Their industry was huge. They had an incredible military. They were so powerful throughout the world. And he says, I'm going to take them from powerful to nothing. And so he says, because of the way they acted, they're going to be judged. Okay, verse 13, because of the Lord's wrath, she will not be inhabited. She will become desolation, every bit of her. Everyone who passes through Babylon will be appalled and scoff because of all her wounds. So because of Babylon's treatment of Judah, it would be destroyed beyond belief. You know, I'm not real good with geography, and I didn't go look at a map. But I was listening to a man this week discuss this, and he said the Euphrates River runs through what was Babylon. And on the west side of the Euphrates River is fertile as can be. That's where all the cities are. That's where all the businesses are. That's where the homes are. On the east side, it might as well be the Sahara Desert. There's nothing over there. To this day, they don't build on that side of the river because there's just nothing. There's no life there. There's nothing to be able to use. That's the area of land we're talking about. Because when God cast his judgment down on it, he finished it off for good. So he said, everyone who passes through Babylon, they'll be appalled and they'll scoff. And they'll have gone through there before. What happened to this place? When they travel through, and they'll see what it is. And all those, look, the Israelites were not just the one, the people of Judah were not just the ones who were attacked by people of Babylon. Babylon had attacked all these nations. And God used all of these nations, these 10 we're talking about, as judgment on his people for not listening. Through those years, he said, if you Remember way back from Old Testament, early, where Moses would tell people, this is what God says, if you follow me, I'll bless you. And if you don't follow me, I'll be forced to curse you. And the forced to curse you part was these nations that God would use to hand out his judgment on his people. But there was one problem with them. They didn't realize it, but if they followed in God's plan to abuse his people, they were going to be part of something in judgment on themselves too. That happens today as well. Because people who persecute Christians, they may not get it here, but if they don't turn their heart back toward God and repent of their sinfulness and ask Christ as their Savior, there's going to be a day when those very people are going to have to stand before Jesus and answer for that. And we'll get further into that as we get toward the end of our lesson. But those nations who come through behind this destruction, it says they'll scoff. Now, I can't remember what scoff meant. It means they're going to go back and go, ha, they finally got it. And they're going to come by and be happy and rejoice, and they're going to laugh. They thought they were so powerful. Look at them now. And so there's going to be this gruff treatment of them. So what do we learn from this so far? God is just, and he'll judge the sin of every nation, not just a few. He's going to go through every person who ever lived, every nation who ever existed, and have his judgment on it based on the way they acted. Other nations are going to rejoice at Babylon's destruction. All right, so go to verse 14, and here's the prophecy Jeremiah going to pronounce on Babylon. Line up in battle formation around Babylon, all you archers. Do not spare an arrow, for she has sinned against the Lord. So I started thinking about this. Started Joshua's 15. Let's go ahead and read 15 and a little bit farther. Raise a war cry against her on every side. She has thrown up her hands of surrender. Her defense towers have fallen. Her walls are demolished. Since this is the Lord's vengeance, has done, do the same to her. And it just started sounding a lot like the way Joshua would call the people, let's go, we get on the other side, we're going to march around the place 7 times. We're not going to have to fire a shot, but we're going to shout and do and the walls are just going to fall down. But you hear that phrasing, wording them from 14 on down, line up in battle formation around Babylon. They were surrounded. Remember when a lot of these militaries, they would surround the city and just starve them out. So, well, you're going to have food and water eventually. When you guys come out, we'll take you. And so, but he says, archers, shoot at her. Do not spare an arrow. Now, I'll go back to my Bonnie and Clyde. When I read that, I said, hey, let me go back and read this again. They fired 130 rounds. You know how many bullets they had? 130. They shot every bullet they had, and they asked the ranger that was in charge of that attack that day, why did you shoot so many times? I mean, it's obvious they were dead. Look, Clyde was hit at least 17 times. Bonnie was hit at least 26 times. That's 43 times the two of them were hit. I'm not going to get into the graphic part. Let me just put it this way. Clyde was dead on the first shot. You can go read the rest of it and find out why. All right, but Wyatt asked him, why did you fire so many shots? He said, because they'd escaped enough times, they weren't going to escape again. We're going to make sure that they were done. And so, same thing, he said, do not spare an arrow. In other words, fire every arrow you have. For she has sinned against the Lord. This is God's vengeance on Babylon, saying, the day is the day, we're taking it down and we're going to finish it off for good. There's not going to be a comeback because we're not going to leave one bullet left. Not one arrow that is going to be left in the pouch here. We're going to shoot every one of them and finish this place off. So raise a war cry. She has thrown up her hands in surrender. Defense towers are falling. Now the defense towers were important because when the defense tower went down, that's where where your spies were at. Then your best archers were there. That was your spot where if everything else starts falling apart, the defense tower was the one that can ward off the enemy a little bit. But when the defense towers fall, look what it says, her walls are demolished. Once the defense tower fell, it was over. There's no more defense left. It's like the last guy that's blocking for the quarterback. Once he's down, quarterback is in trouble. Okay, so he says, this is the Lord's vengeance. Take your vengeance. As she has done, do the same to her. So don't leave anything. Now, back to a little history. This did happen in 539 BC, in the 47th year of the 70-year exile, Persia, and King Cyrus invaded Babylon and took them out. And so this very thing that Jeremiah prophesies does happen as the Persians attack and wipe out Babylon. Later on, Greece would take over Persia. And you remember in our study of Daniel how we had the nation after nation that represented the statue, the clay, the iron, the bronze, the gold. And that was nation after nation, all leading all the way up to Romans. So Persia would take over Babylon. Now, verse 16, cut off the sower from Babylon as well as him who wields the sickle at harvest time, because of the oppressor's sword. Each will turn to his own people, each will flee to his own land. So there won't be any agriculture anymore. The agriculture has ceased. Some would leave and go home. After Persia would take over, King Cyrus would say, okay, some of you that want to go home, just go home. He would bring a time when they could go back. And so here it's talking about the agriculture would go, the people who farmed, they would leave. They would be allowed to go back home. Now verse 17, Israel is a stray lamb, chased by lions. The first who devoured of him was the king of Assyria. You remember our study on the northern kingdom of Israel. Assyria was the nation who took them. The last who crushed his bones was the king Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. So we're going bookends from Assyria to Babylon here. And Jeremiah's talking about this. The northern kingdom was never reestablished either, by the way, because they had scattered so much. All right, so he's doing just a little review here as he's talking. Israel is a stray lamb. They don't have a home. And being able to go back home, even though Jerusalem's been demolished now, because remember Nebuchadnezzar comes in, he'd had it after Hezekiah rebelled, and he goes in and wipes out the city. So it says they're a stray lamb. They don't have a place right now because Babylon's being destroyed. Assyria's taking over northern kingdom, and now Jerusalem's a nothing for now. And he's naming a little review here of what would happen. But look in 18. Therefore, this is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says. Remember, we've been reading God of Judah. Now he names Israel because he's putting them all back together again. Says, I am about to punish the king of Babylon and his land, just as I punished the king of Assyria. So he pronounces this punishment right here on Babylon. I will return Israel to his grazing land, and he will feed on, listen to these places, Carmel, Bashan. He will be satisfied in the hill country of Ephraim and Gilead. What about those four nations? They're all similar. They're all in the promised land. So he's going to return his people back to the promised land. Okay, and in verse 20, in those days and at that time, this is the Lord's declaration. One will search for Israel's iniquity, but there will be none, and for Judah's sins, but they will not be found. For I will forgive those I leave as a remnant. And we've said in our class and others' classes as well a lot of times that there's always a remnant, that God always preserves a remnant throughout history. So Satan's going to have a search. Look here. One will search for Israel's iniquity, there'll be none. And this is Satan's search for anything to convict God's people. But God is going, he says here in his prophecy through Jeremiah, he's going to forgive those sins and restore his people. All right, so we got them. Remember he said earlier, you're going to go in exile for 70 years, but after the 70 years, back home. And Daniel, remember, he was reading the words of Jeremiah, and he goes, wait a minute, this 7 years is almost up. And he starts to get excited because he knows when it's over, we're all going to get to go back. Okay, so, but it says there will be none, no iniquity for Judah's sins, but they will not be found. So if you go over into Revelation, you see where Satan is looking desperately for sinfulness, anything to convict or condemn God's people, and he won't be able to find it because of Jesus' blood covering it all. Okay, so you start to see the parallels, I hope, of what Jeremiah is saying about the time period then in that prophecy and how it points forward and parallels with the prophecy in Revelation as well. Because there's two Babylons. There's the same treatment of both. And that's how Babylon then will be destroyed we're fixing to read Babylon in the future will be destroyed. There's going to be the search for people, condemnation, so that Satan can use anything, any other. Remember, we've already been through the 10 nations. Satan's running out of nations to use. And it won't be able to find any iniquity, so God's people will be forgiven, those he leaves as a remnant. So we see this parallel going on. Okay, go to verse 33. This is what the Lord of armies says. Israelites and Judeans alike have been oppressed. All their captors hold them fast. They refuse to release them. So there's going to be this additional judgment for mistreatment. Their Redeemer, verse 34. Here's where you start seeing the hopefulness. Their Redeemer is strong. The Lord of armies is his name. He will fervently champion their cause so that he may bring rest to the earth, but turmoil to those who live in Babylon. You know, sometimes I go through the day and think to myself, in my prayers and just personal thoughts, I say, how would Satan be able to have so much success and get away with it like he does? And you ever do that? Just think, this world is getting more and more evil, and it don't seem like some days that Satan's getting it. And when, God, are you gonna take it out on him? When are you gonna slow him down a little bit? Because it seems like he just gets more and more and more. But it's because people have decided to, just like those people in Jeremiah's day and before and since, they in rebellion to God. I don't need God. I got this idol over here. I got an idol over here. I just don't need him. And because of that treatment of God and disrespect towards him, God says, okay, if that's what you want, have at it. So this nation and this nation and this nation can, and I believe he's judging our nation now. Some folks may not agree with me on this, and that's just fine. But I hear global warming all the time, and you probably hear that stuff on the net. There may be some bits and pieces of climate and stuff that's what I don't even know. For me, it's not global warming, it's global judgment. I believe in global judgment. I'm sure nature has its things that God does that no scientist is going to ever convince me he's smart enough to be able to explain. But for me, it's global judgment. I look at the things that happen and I say, well, if this nation or our nation would turn back to God the way it ought to, probably have a little bit less of these problems. Just makes common sense for me. So anyway, look here in 34. The Redeemer is strong. The Lord is his name. He will fervently champion their cause. So they'll bring, listen, rest to the earth, but turmoil to those who live in Babylon. So that's our point forward. That's the pointing forward. So we're talking about redemption, the restoration of the remnant, the forgiveness of sin, the judgment of all nations. It brings peace and rest, and it brings judgment on Babylon. And now we're talking about the future Babylon that is a representation of all nations that are against God. Anyone is in rebellion to God, but it represents the world. So now let's start summarizing a little bit because we got to wrap up. So like Sodom and Gomorrah, these people are going to be shocked. Babylon is going to be taken by surprise. They're not going to expect their downfall. They're not even going to pay any attention to this pronouncement from Jeremiah. They don't care what he says anyway. And they're going to be destroyed like that. And they're not going to be expecting it. Just like Sodom and Gomorrah, same thing. Those people were just happy-go-lucky, living their lives, didn't think anything of wham. Now think forward. What's going to happen on the day of the rapture? Same thing. People just going to be living their lives, riding in cars, working at their jobs, playing ball, whatever, watching a movie, flying on a plane, riding in a bus. And they're going to be taken by surprise. All right, so Babylon represents the world, anything who rejects God, all people throughout history that were in rejection of God. That you can call them Babylon in the future. Pharaoh, Herod, Hitler, I've named some, Osama bin Laden, ungodly leaders today. Anyone who is like this. Jeremiah 51 and 61, you're right there near it. In your Bible, it goes Jeremiah 51 and 61. I got to find it too because there it is. So after this, to wrap up, Jeremiah, after this, he gives the word to Baruch, who's the writer. Go give this to your brother. Baruch had a brother, Sariah, and they went on a trip, okay? He says, you take what I'm telling you to Babylon and read it. Watch this in 61. Jeremiah told Sarai, when you get to Babylon, see that you read all these words aloud. Say, the Lord, you have threatened to cut off this place so that no one will live in it. People or animals, indeed, it will remain desolate forever. When you have finished reading the scroll, tie a stone to it and throw it into the middle of the Euphrates River. And then say, in the same way, Babylon will sink and never rise again because of the disaster I'm bringing on her. Okay? So that was Jeremiah's day. Take this scroll, tie a rock to it, after you read it to the people, and chunk it in the river and say, that's what you're going to be like. You're going to head down the tank and you're going to be in the bottom of the water forever. You're never coming back up. Now go over to Revelations again. This is the last time. Revelations 18 and 21. This will be our last verse for today. Revelations 18 and 21. This is Babylon's final fall. The future Babylon. Satan's headquarters, we'll call it. Watch. 21. Then a mighty angel picked up a stone like a large millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, in this way Babylon, the great city, will be thrown down violently and never be found again. So we see the prophecy then and the prophecy in the future as Babylon, representing the world, will be cast away, never to be seen again. Okay, so just like Judah, we're in exile. Judah was in exile for 70 years. We're in exile now. We've got a home that we're not at yet. Just like Judah, we await and we look forward to going home. Just like Babylon, those in rejection of God will suffer an eternal consequence. We've already talked about that. And God will restore, and He'll create a new heaven and a new earth. And Babylon's going to be destroyed forever. So while we're here, we're supposed to do the same thing that Jeremiah told the people then, that God would say, while you're there, tell as many as you can to turn and follow God, so they'll be part of that remnant. We're the remnant here, and we want to stay part of that remnant and add more, because anyone who's not made that choice is going to be thrown into the lake of fire this time with the millstone on their neck instead of in the river. But it's going to be demolished forever. So when we think some days, how does Satan get away with all this stuff? Because he's loose in our world. And that's why sin exists. And when you have that sin, somebody says, why do bad things happen to good people? Because Satan is around still. And until he's put away forever, that's going to be the case. It's going to happen that way sometimes. But God has already declared, in the end, I will set things right. Anybody got comments or questions? That was a lot we bounced around. I'm sorry.